I am going to show you the best way to roll coils. For this upcoming project, we're going to be making coil pots, which are going to look something like this. You have this option where you can see how the individual coils make up a larger pot. You can see the designs are crafted and designed in a way that builds a pattern from the bottom to the top, and it relies mostly on how well you can roll a coil, how evenly and smoothly you can create the design using the coil. So the best way to roll coils is start out with a clean surface. I suggest rolling on one of these mats or directly on the table. If you roll on the table or a mat, just make sure that there is no dried clay bits, because you will be rolling the clay all over the surface. If it's dirty, it's going to pick up all that dried, crumbly clay and be in the surface of your pot. So just make sure to clean off the table. I'm just going to take a chunk of clay and begin pinching and kind of squishing it into a coil shape first. So I'm just rolling the clay between my hands and getting it into a long coil shape. The next step is to put it on the table and begin rolling it with your hands. And when I roll coils, I'm going to roll from my fingertips all the way to the bottom of my hand. I'm not just using the top parts, because I want to roll this coil of clay over and over on itself. So the easiest way to do that is to use your entire hand. And so I'm just taking my fingers and rolling all the way to the palm of my hand and slowly moving it out. And I'm going fairly fast. If you go a little bit slower, you can start to get what is like a tall, thinner coil, which is not exactly what you want. It's harder to roll. If that starts to happen, you just have to turn it up on its side, pat it down a little bit, and just go a little bit faster with a little bit more pressure. As far as the size of the coil goes, you want something that's roughly the size of your finger, depending on how large your hands are. You know, your index finger, your middle finger is fine. The thinner the coil gets, the thinner the wall of your pot will be. So remember that you're creating the sides of your pot by how thick this coil is. So finger size is pretty good. And that is a basic coil. When the clay is super wet, you can manipulate the coil into different shapes. I'll show you a couple of different options for your first coil warm-up. So once you have your coil created, the first option is creating some sort of frame for your coil design. So I'm just going to pinch this together. And now you have this interior space which you're just going to fill with a whole bunch of different coil designs. And you'll notice that once you roll the coil, it's pretty malleable, or it can be moved and turned into a lot of different shapes, and you can just create a design on the inside. You can have rhyme or reason to it, or you can just kind of go and build whatever design you want. Also notice that I am not scoring and slipping in between each piece here, and I'll show you the reason why afterwards. This clay is super, super soft. So if I was to work in one class period and create a design, I would be able to smooth everything together today. And that's what makes the coil design stick. Once you've created some sort of design, I'll just shorten this a little bit so I can show you what it looks like as a single piece. Once you've filled in the frame of something, now I'm just going to take my finger or a wooden tool with a little bit of a curve to it and smooth the surface so you can't see the coil designs anymore. And this is what makes all the coils stick together. So I'm not scoring and slipping in between each piece. If you don't want to use your finger, you can use a tool here. I'm not pressing super hard because I do still want to see the design that is now facing the table. And if I squish down too hard, I can flatten all those coils and you lose a little bit of detail. But I do want to take the time and smooth the entire back side of this so you can't see the design anymore. So once that's all smoothed together, I would just flip over the piece and you can see the coil design still exists. So that's your first option for one of the coil warm-ups. The second option is working inside of some sort of bowl or mold. And I've started one here already. I'll just kind of pop this out so you see how I started this one. So I just have a regular sort of bowl here. And what I'm going to do is line the interior of this bowl with strips of newspaper before I start placing clay in here. And what you can do, you have the option of placing clay on the inside of the bowl or around the outside of the bowl. It depends on where you want the design to show up. If you create the coils on the inside of the bowl, you'll be smoothing the inside of your piece and leave the design on the outside. Something like this, something like that, where you can see the designs on the outside, but you can't see anything on the inside. If you want the opposite effect and have the designs show up on the interior of the bowl, you're going to build your pot around the outside of this bowl. So I'll just do the inside, and you would rip newspaper strips. So I just have a whole bunch of strips of newspaper here that I'm gonna crisscross in the middle here to cover the interior of this plastic bowl. Because if I was to fill this bowl with a whole bunch of clay, that clay is going to stick to the sides of the bowl and I won't be able to get it out. So to start off, you're just going to take a coil, and I'll just roll a fresh coil here. And again, I want it to be fairly thick. And I'm just going to create a spiral as the bottom of my piece. So now I can take this coil and stick it right into the bottom. And now I just use my coil designs to fill all the inside of this bowl. So I can take more coils and do different designs. Now it's also easier if you have multiple pieces ready. So I'll just make a couple of spirals here to fill around the pot. Do one more. And you can plan it out, or you can just kind of go with the flow and fill it with random coil designs. Again, these are just coil warm-ups, so you can get used to rolling the coils. So the next step is really just to place them inside, and I'm pushing these against the edge of the bowl because I want them to form to the outer curvature of the bowl here. So I want to push it against the inside of this bowl. Again, if I was working on the other side, I'd be pushing it and forming it to the outer part of this bowl. So I'll just fill, maybe I'll just fill up, do a couple more. Okay, so I've filled the inside of this bowl with a coil spiral as the base and then smaller coil spirals all around. Now I do have some open spaces in between the coils, and all I'm going to do is take a little bit of clay and roll it into little balls of clay and smush it into those areas. And that will fill it up. And on the outside, you won't have holes in your bowl. Okay, so now I'm just going to take my finger and smooth the inside of this. So I can't see the designs, but I'm pushing against the edge of the bowl here to make sure everything's smooth. If at this point you need to fill in any extra areas, if you find that an area is pretty thin or your coil doesn't totally cover where you want it to, you can just add extra soft clay. Okay. So at this point, it's pretty much done. I could fill the rest of this if I wanted, but for demo purposes, I will not. So I'm just gonna pop this out. Once it's all smoothed, you can take it out of the bowl. I'm just gonna lift up on the newspaper and unpeel the newspaper off the outer edge. And it'll leave this coil design in the shape of this bowl. So that can now be dried in the kiln room. So a small little coil dish. The last option for your coil warm-up is really just to let you know that when you're combining two different types of coil or two different types of forming methods, the coils, when you roll a coil, it creates spiral clay particles on the surface. And if you wanted to attach coil designs to anything else, like a slab or, for instance, a tiny little pinch pot, the surface clay particles are slightly different because when you're pinching clay, you're flattening those clay particles. And wherever a coil would be attached to this, it has a higher chance of cracking in the kiln if it's not scored and slipped together. So that's the one thing you have to pay attention to when you're combining different forming methods. So I'm just gonna attach coils to the top of this to build this up. So the first thing I'm gonna do is just score the top rim, because that's where all the clay is going to go. Anything built above that first coil that you put on can be smoothed just with your finger. You don't need to score and slip. Again, it's just attaching the different methods of clay construction together. So I'm just gonna score the top of that, take a little bit of clay, and begin to build up with coils on top. One little tip that I'll tell you, you can embed or change the shape. So if you wanted to have some sort of design in your piece where the coils are integrated into the piece below, you can cut out any sort of area. And if I wanted, let's score down into that. So if I wanted to put small little spirals in each of those little holes, I can now score and slip those little spiral pieces into the surface. So again, this is just an option, practicing rolling coils and making something that's a little bit taller than a bowl can give you, or just something a little bit different for your warm-up exercise. I won't go too into it, but I'll just show you how to do that. So I am going to score just the lower portions of these here, just so they will sit into these little depressed areas and not crack, because again, that's where it's likely to crack, is when you're attaching the two different methods. So So I have a little bit of slip here. I'll just paint some slip on those little cutouts. And take my spirals and squish them in. And I'll do a little extra securing by running a coil all around the top just to get everything together. I'll put some slip on the corners here. Again, I'm only putting slip and scoring where the pinch pot is because I'm attaching a coil on top of these spirals. I don't need to score and slip that because it's the same construction method. But again, I want to score and slip it to the pinch pot. And there we go. So the last step for this one is to smooth all those coils on the inside so it only leaves the design on the outside. But because there is no mold, I'm not smoothing inside the bowl and I'm not smoothing against the table, you really have to pay attention to how well you're supporting the side of your piece. So that's why I'm actually going to use the wooden tool here. I find it easier to apply an even pressure, especially when I'm doing something that's a little bit more delicate. So I'm cradling this side of the piece with my hand here and smoothing the inside using the tool. So I can't see the coil design on the inside, but I can see it on the outside still. And again, this is how everything stays together. So you just take your time and smooth the inside. And again, if you needed to add any extra clay in areas that seem thin, now is the time to do it when the clay is very, very soft. So there you have your pinch pot with coil design embedded into the top of it. And you can clean up, you can see my slip sticking out. So I would just take a little paintbrush and clean up those lines a little bit. And that's your options for your coil warm-up.